And it's my great pleasure now to welcome Larry Summers to speak with us. Secretary Summers was the 71st Secretary of the Treasury in the Clinton administration and served as Director of the White House National Economic Council in the Obama administration. He was Chief Economist at the World Bank. He is President Emeritus of Harvard University, and he currently is the Charles W. Eliot University Professor, also at Harvard. Welcome to you, Mr. Summers.
Good to be with you, Amanda, and good to be with Connexus.
Thank you very much. So The Economist recognised your influence when it defined the Summers Doctrine, which is an approach to economic policy during financial crisis that fuses a microeconomic laissez-faire mentality with a macroeconomic activism. Markets should allocate capital, labour and ideas without interference, but sometimes markets go haywire and must be counteracted forcefully by government. So, Larry, what do you think governments should be doing now?
I think what we've seen has been, in the broadest sense, appropriate at the economic policy level. We've recognized that there are all sorts of vicious spirals that could get started. Collapsing asset prices, leading to deleveraging, leading to forced selling, leading to more collapses in asset prices, lack of spending, leading to lack of income, leading to lack of spending, leading to a further collapse. And so we've recognized that it's very important for government to step in and provide a strong response that contains these kinds of vicious cycles. And that's what we've seen with big increases in budget deficits, big increases in support for potential spenders among the unemployed, big increases in the support for credit markets. There are lots of questions about the details as they differ between countries, but I think broadly, in terms of the speed and the force of the response to an economic downturn, it's greater than anything we've ever seen before. And I think that is very much to be welcomed.
You've played a key role in addressing every major financial crisis in the last 2 decades. In the 1990s, you were a leader in crafting the US response to international financial crises in Mexico, Brazil, Russia, Japan, Asian emerging markets. And as one of President Obama's chief economic advisors, your thinking helped shape the US response to the 2008 financial crisis. I know that you've just mentioned that you think the policy responses have been appropriate and measured, but is there something more innovative that we need right now? What do you think that you would like to see from the government in terms of something a little bit more innovative, what's needed more for the long term?
Like, the biggest thing we need is a more effective strategy than we've mounted with respect to COVID itself. That the truth is that the big difference between this crisis and the crises that took place when I was in government is that those crises arose out of the financial system and the economy. And then they had all kinds of knock-on effects. This crisis has arisen from an external force, the virus, and then has had all kinds of cascading effects through the economy. The reality is that if people don't feel safe going to work or going to shop or going out to eat, that's going to limit economic performance no matter what the interest rate is and no matter what the level of the government budget deficit is. So I'm disappointed that we're not seeing more ingenuity in the United States going into pervasive testing and contact tracing. I'm disappointed that there isn't more global coordination in the efforts to make sure that when a vaccine is discovered, it gets produced and distributed as widely as possible. I'm disappointed that we're not doing more on the global public good of developing capacities to respond aggressively when these pandemics come, because this one will not be the last one. As far as economic policy is concerned, I'd like to see stronger policy commitments to supporting the consumption of individuals.
So, Secretary Summers, I mean, we've talked a lot today about the state of the world and the risks that our investors are facing, but we haven't really talked specifically about the United States, and you've expressed there some disappointments that you've seen in terms of policy responses. But can we be candid here? How do you think that your country is faring right now? You look around at what's happening in the United States, and can we have a little bit of a conversation about that in terms of not just economic policy but leadership generally? What do you think needs to change?
So I think it's important to separate two issues. On the narrow economics of the business cycle, we have had a good month. The retail sales figure, the employment figure, all of that was better than almost any of us would have expected a month ago. I think there's substantial risk of a W-shaped recovery and a K-shaped recovery. A W-shaped recovery meaning we'll rise and then we'll fall back. A K-shaped recovery means some people, the rich, are going up while other people are going down. What are the risks that could interfere with the recovery? The most important one is that COVID will get back out of control in substantial parts of the country. People will get nervous and they will stop spending. There's also risks of strains arising out of the financial system because tenants aren't paying their rent, mortgage holders aren't paying their mortgages, and that in turn will find its way back to the financial system. There's also issues for the United States in its dependence on emerging markets and its financial institutions' dependence on emerging markets and the very great difficulty that they are facing. So I think it's certainly possible that we will see a steady march upwards in the economy, but the risk of a downturn is, I think, real. I think the more profound question is about the functioning of American democracy at home and in leading the world at a time when pandemic is a threat, at a time when the relationship with China is much more complex than it has been in the last 50 years, at a time when global cooperation on public good issues like climate change or terrorism is absolutely essential, and at a time when the United States is in many ways the model of democratic governance. And yet we are the land of potholes in highways, of airports that look like they come from 40 years ago, of a declining life expectancy for our male population, of manifest racial injustice, of condemnation and unwillingness to support the idea of international community, of educational achievement for our children that lags half at least of the other industrial countries in the world, of for our poor health record, the need to spend more than almost 50% more than any other country does. We are in so many ways a society that isn't working. And given that we are such an exemplar for others, that sense that while sometimes there'll be recessions and sometimes there'll be booms, in a deeper sense, we are an increasingly polarized and ineffective society is an immense challenge for those of us who believe in American destiny. For hundreds of years, it's been the case, with very, very few exceptions, that in any debate about the forecasting the future of America, the optimists have been right and the pessimists have been wrong. But that is certainly more at issue today than at any time in my professional lifetime. And I think that is something in which the rest of the world has a very profound stake.
I think that's very well articulated, Professor Summers. And facing up to the fact that society is not working is something that's quite a big thing to do. And we heard earlier today from Greg Jensen at Bridgewater, who talked about this balance between capitalism and democracy and how they balance or can balance each other out. Do you think part of the solution to the problems that you're talking about is a bigger role for government?
I think a bigger role for governments that can command the confidence and trust of people is very important. Look, a canonical good that the private sector buys is a television set. A canonical good that the government buys is a year in a college or a day in a hospital. And the relative price of those goods has changed by a factor of dozens over the last generation. And so whatever your values were on how much should be done by government and how much should be done by the private sector, given that the relative cost of what's done by government has gone up so much, it's hard to believe that you shouldn't believe in a larger government today. And yet, the fact that government is so distrusted raises some very real questions.
You were the only Treasury Secretary in the last half a century to have left office with the national budget in surplus. We've heard a bit today about the closer working between monetary and fiscal policies, and there's a bit of hype around MMT at the moment. Does a fiscal deficit matter? Is that an important distinction to have a deficit or a surplus in a fiscal sense?
I think in the long run, it's hard to believe that deficits don't matter at all. The amount that I can spend over my lifetime is clearly related to the present value of my incomes over my lifetime, plus my current assets. That's just arithmetic. So definitely budget deficits matter, and any suggestion that they don't is, I think, a misguided one. I think thinking in terms of the budget deficit or the ratio of debt to income as being a determinative thing that has to be controlled for health, I don't think is a terribly helpful paradigm. It's one thing for a family to borrow for what's obviously a rainy day, a child getting sick or some such. It's a very different thing to borrow for ongoing consumption. It's very different to borrow to buy the place you're living in, where you're substituting interest payments for what would otherwise be rent payments, than it is to borrow to buy some far larger and more expensive house than you would otherwise ever contemplate. So I don't think we can judge the size of the deficit or the size of the debt to GDP ratio absent looking at a whole constellation of other factors. If I look at the United States, yes, I'm worried about the budget deficit, but in all honesty, I'm more worried about the inequality deficit. I'm more worried about the environmental deficit. I'm more worried about the crumbling roads deficit than I am about the budget deficit. And there's a reason for that. which is the interest rate zero, at which in real terms, at which the government can borrow. And I believe the rate at which the debt burdens when you defer maintenance is a lot greater than that zero in real terms interest rate on paper debt. So yes, I don't want to be indiscriminately in favor of budget deficits or to pretend that they don't matter, but I also don't subscribe to the financial orthodoxy that excessive borrowing is the major problem facing the United States right now.
Professor Summers, we've got a question here from our audience from the University Superannuation Scheme in the UK, which is the largest pension fund in the UK, from Tom Lasky, who works in investment strategy there. He's asking, how do the hysteresis risks after the COVID shock compare with the hysteresis seen after the GFC, i.e. the output anything from 10 to 20% below trend?
I don't think we know yet. The question is, how much will there be a permanent reduction in output, and how much is this a temporary reduction after the disease? I think it's impossible to know. On the one hand, this is a deeper, more disruptive change in many ways than the financial shock, which suggests that the aftershocks will be greater. On the other hand, I think there'll probably be some enduring productivity increases as firms learn how to do business like this. I think, for example, people will get investment briefings in more efficient ways than they did previously because of the technologies people have gotten used to during this period. So my guess is that the hysteresis costs will be a bit lower than they were after the 2007 crisis. I also think that there's a certain amount of scholarship suggesting that growth had been slowing prior to the 2007 crisis in ways that people didn't expect. So some of the declines in output relative to forecast probably didn't have to do with the effects of the recession, but probably just had instead to do with a generalized slowing of productivity growth. So my instinct would be that if we manage policy right, there will be some hysteresis effects, but less apparent hysteresis effects than there was in the previous crisis.
Earlier today, we asked our investors in the audience what they thought were the most important unintended consequences over the long term of the policy responses. And inflation certainly was at the top of that list, but also inflated asset prices, inequality, which you also mentioned. Can you comment specifically on inflation and from a long-term investor point of view, do you think that's a risk, and how should they be allocating because of that?
If you had asked me when I was in graduate school in the 1970s about the relevance of the zero interest rate liquidity trap, I would have said that was economic history, and I would have been wrong. If you'd asked me during the 1990s, would we see a sustained period in which output was constrained by the zero interest rate bound, I would have thought that was very, very unlikely. So I think that it's a mistake to think that any kind of substantial increase in inflation is inconceivable. Things have a way of coming back. On the other hand, I think there's a lot of deflationary pressures out there right now. I think workers are really fearful. I think that labor has less power in terms of unionization than it once did, less power to extract rents from firms. than it once did. So I wouldn't want to be predicting a return to 1970s style inflation, but I think it's less likely than it was. I think it's substantially more likely than I would have guessed 6 months ago.
Professor, you were a full professor at the age of 28, one of the youngest ever in Harvard's recent history. Obviously then went on to lead the university, and now universities all over the world are facing disruption and the education system. Do you see this as a permanent or long-lasting disruption? What do you see as the future of universities and education in the United States and elsewhere?
This should be the best opportunity that ever came to the leading universities to spread their influence, magnify their impact all over the world by creating video content of various kinds that is both more engaging than watching a lecture, susceptible to reaching a larger scale than was before, and at the same time achieving greater personalization than was ever possible before. Will that take place? I don't know whether the great universities of the world will step up in that regard, but there is a potential opportunity for healthcare to be very dramatically transformed and higher education to be very dramatically transformed.
So you've described some of the disruption, the dislocation, the risks currently facing the United States and observed them very eloquently. What do you see as the projected future? Is this a time to pivot? Will this be go on for some time before we actually see any real change? Is there hope, is my question.
Winston Churchill famously said the United States does the right thing, but only after exhausting all the alternatives. I think a great strength of American society has always been its resilience. This looked like a very difficult time. So did the period when Jimmy Carter was warning about crisis of the national spirit. So did the period when we were finding a need to adopt a détente policy and increasingly accommodate the Soviet Union and respond to the traumas of Watergate. So did the challenges of riots in the streets over the Vietnam War and over race in the 1960s when the country seemed to be falling apart. Indeed, Patrick Henry observed that the spirit of the revolution has already been lost in 1792. So just 5 years after we had won the Revolutionary War. So I think it's a great strength of America that America has this capacity for what one might call self-denying prophecy, that people are always predicting doom. And as they predict doom, they set in motion changes that lead that doom not to happen. So I am hopeful that America's best days lie in the future.
Let me just bring in China for a second. You did mention it earlier, and we've got a couple of sessions tomorrow where we're going to talk in more detail around China. But from an economic point of view, it's the second biggest economy now. It still has some opening up to do. But what's your view of this tension between the US and China, both from a trade point of view, but really looking, 10 years hence? Do you see China as a real threat to the United States in terms of its global position in the world?
I think that it is a potential major threat. I think the important thing to remember is that if China can get itself to standards of living that are 2/3 of Taiwan's, it will then have an economy that's twice as large as the United States. And history suggests that those kinds of power transitions don't happen easily. What I've said is that the United States and China are like two people who don't have much time for each other, stuck in a 2-oared lifeboat in a turbulent sea a long way from the shore. It's not really about their affection for each other. It's not really about their ability to inflict pain on each other. It's, can they find ways of accommodating that enable them to get to the shore safely? And I think we're going to need a diplomacy of mutual respect and grudging accommodation in areas of greatest importance. And I think that's going to require restraint that we haven't always seen from the top leadership in both countries.
Professor, we're facing an election in November in your country, and no one knows which way it's going to go. I'd love you to be able to predict that. You've worked in Obama and Clinton administrations. But more importantly, I think, do you see profoundly different economic outcomes depending on who wins the election? And can you let the investors know on this live stream, what you think they should be prepared for in regardless of the result?
I think there are three scenarios. I think there's about a 1/3 chance that President Trump will be reelected, about a 1/3 chance that Vice President Biden will be elected, and about a 1/3 chance that Vice President Biden will be elected in what might be called a repudiation election, which is to say by a very substantial margin, with a sense that the country has turned dramatically against Trumpism and dramatically towards something new. I think the biggest changes that you'll see, I think the biggest thing you'll see if President Trump is reelected is continuity of chaos and truculence. And I'm not very optimistic about what that will mean for investors or for the global economy. I think with Vice President Biden's election, you'll see a return to normalcy in the same way that if Mitt Romney became president, you would see a return to normalcy. And I think that will tend to be good for markets. I think you will, with the Democratic administration, be likely to see higher business taxation. And that will have some, I think, fairly modest impacts. I think you will see more competent public investment in support of economic growth, whether it's public investment in infrastructure or public investment in science and technology or public investment in education, and that will be a positive for growth. And I think you'll see much more support for trade peace than for trade war. And that will lead to some reknitting together of globalization, which will tend to be a positive for growth. So I'm pretty optimistic that the historical pattern, which is that the economy tends to do better with Democrats than Republicans, will reassert itself.
And just to finally finish off now, Secretary Summers, you mentioned the things that you're concerned about: inequality, sustainability, the infrastructure in the United States. How can the investors listening to you today gather around those issues and actually have some impact and invest in those issues on the private side? What's your call to action for them?
I think that there will be an increasing movement into what are seen as socially responsible investments, and those who are in early will benefit not just from the good things that happen in more energy efficient company, but the fact that there'll be a wave of buying pressure from those who come in later. I think there will be considerable interest in moving to larger roles for the private sector, both in infrastructure, and if the nonprofit sector drops the ball, as I think is possible in higher education, the use of technology in education may be an attractive sphere for investments as well.
Secretary Summers, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you. Thank you very much for your time and for joining us here today.
The pleasure has been mine. Thank you.
Thank you.